begin with I would just like to begin with what's called in Australia an acknowledgement of country. And I don't know whether many people have been doing these or whether they've been done at the beginning of each day. If they have, you'll know what they are. And if they aren't, it's where you stop for a moment to reflect on the place that you are and who your antecedents are and what your heritage is. So I'm just putting in the chat there that I'm on a land called Dharawal country, and it's known since the colonisation of Australia as Austenmere. And I welcome all of you to put in the place where you are from. If you know its name in its original language or in your own language, then please feel free to put that there. And I'd like to acknowledge all the elders. So I'm not just talking in Australia about the Indigenous elders. Given that we're all here gathered this week for an SFL conference, I'd like to acknowledge all our elders. We have lost a number of those elders in the last 10 years, whether you want to talk about Michael Halliday, Ruqaiya Hassan, Bill Greaves, Helen De Silva Joyce, Gunter Kress, the list goes on. And it's I think, a hard time for our field, and we are rebuilding and re-emerging, and we still have, of course, elders that are alive today, like in Australia, Jim Martin and David Butt and so on. And in other countries, you also have your own elders. So I would just like to give thanks and acknowledge that we're all here today because we all share the same elders from our own very valuable SFL community. So in that vein, I would like to welcome Emilia, who is next in line. So Emilia carries on this fantastic line of research and thinking and looking at language that we have inherited from our antecedents. So for those of you who don't know Emilia, she's a senior lecturer at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, and her research interests and expertise lie in social semiotics, in critical and multimodal discourse analysis, in early language and literacy, and in multiliteracies education. She, of course, draws on both social semiotic theory and systemic functional approaches to her research of language and multimodality. And she's also examined the interaction between the design of hypermedia texts and semiotic technologies and their use. She's had her research published in lots of really reputable journals. I'm not going to name them all. And in that vein, I would really like to welcome Emilia, and thanks for doing the final plenary on the morning of the conference. And just, do you want me to do the housekeeping now, Vin, or at the end? I'll do it both maybe. So there's a couple of housekeeping issues for today. One is that I was going to be chairing all day, but I can only chair for the morning, and Sally Humphrey and Vin will be chairing for the afternoon sessions. And we have two little swaps that are going on. So you're going to need to make an amendment to your timetable. So the two amendments are: from session 2B this afternoon, the final session on SFL and appraisal by Fevzudina Sarachevich, I'm not sure if I'm saying correctly, and Liliana Mitkovska, that is going to move into lunchtime into Strand 1A that Vin will chair. Vin has kindly offered to give up her lunchtime so that SFL and appraisal presentation can move to the end of the morning presentation in room 1A. And the other housekeeping is there's another swap, which is that Olivia Inwood in room 2C in the afternoon, this is the one on SFL and multimodality in media, which I won't be chairing. I think Vin will be chairing this one, or Sally. Sorry, Vin?
Sally.
Oh, Sally Humphrey will be chairing session 2C instead of me, but the first person and the last person are now going to swap. So Aoni, I'm not going to say your last name because it's the pronunciation slipped my mind, and Olivia are swapping, with Olivia going first and Aoni going last. So if you could note down those changes, that would be great. And without further ado, I will pass over to Emilia. And please hold your questions off till the end. Raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and you can speak directly to Emilia or type a question in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Shushi, and for the acknowledgement of country. I'd start by first making sure I'm sharing my screen. Can't actually see. What am I sharing at the moment?
You're sharing your notes as well. So do you know how to just see?
Yeah, I know.
With the advanced options.
It's the other desktop I'm meant to be sharing. That should, can you see my water picture?
Yes.
All right, great. So, and that's better, I think. I'd like to first follow on from Shushi to acknowledge the traditional custodians and owners of the land on which I live, learn, work and play, the Burmata people of the Daruk clan of the Eora Nation, who have nurtured this land since the Dreamtime and who have never ceded their land. I pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and to any First Nations people in the audience today. I would also like to sincerely thank Vinto and her colleagues around, not just from University of Australia, where we have Angela Thomas, but also from other universities in Australia, sorry, University of Tasmania, where we have Angela Thomas, but also from other universities in Australia, such as ACU, for example, and University of Wollongong, who have been helping with the conference, but Vin especially for founding the Systemic Functional Linguistics interest group. And thank you so much for inviting me to present at this very engaging, stimulating conference today. And what I'll talk about today is our research on software as semiotic technology, in which I've engaged with a number of people, but in which would not have happened without the influence and direction and mentorship and generosity of Theo van Leeuwen, and then thinking about how we can extend that to multiliteracy pedagogies. So I'd like to just acknowledge the role that Theo van Leeuwen has played in shaping this direction of research, but also to acknowledge Theo as a very generous mentor and colleague and friend. Theo first invited me and Keo Halloran to apply for an Australian Research Council Discovery Grant to work on a project that used PowerPoint as a case study for developing a social theory of semiotic technologies, or technologies for making meaning. And in fact, even towards the end of my PhD, so we're talking 2005 or so, in which I'd adapted tools from SFL to the multimodal analysis of websites for children and applied them to the study of how website design interacts with its use. I remember Theo van Leeuwen giving a presentation for PhD students in multimodality and asking us to examine and think about not only texts and interactions, but also the semiotic technologies behind them, including software. So he took us on a bit of a tour of PowerPoint, and I thought that was quite interesting that we were looking at the options in PowerPoint and so on. Sumin Zhao has also had a shaping role in all of this work. She joined the project after she completed her PhD in 2011 and was brilliant in challenging our thinking and then managing to organize some of our jointly developed ideas about PowerPoint as semiotic technology into an impressively elegant model of PowerPoint as a semiotic practice, which I'll show a bit later in this presentation. There have also been a number of other people, such as Gunking Folle, Søren Vilgen Poulsen, and other members of the Center for Multimodal Communication in South Denmark University, who have further enhanced or expanded some of the ideas that I'll present in this talk, and challenged us to extend our work to social media and consider broader social practices. So I'll first start by presenting the social semiotic model for critical multimodal studies of software as semiotic technology that we have developed through a number of years since 2009, and then give some examples of how exploring semiotic software through the lens of systemic functional theory have helped us extend the theory, but also, and more importantly, really understand the power of software to shape the ways in which we communicate, the ways in which we make meaning. And finally, I'll conclude with some ideas for developing multimodal literacy pedagogies that encourage a critical perspective towards software as semiotic technology. The basic premise of the work that I present today is that research into contemporary communication can no longer ignore the power of software. For decades, digital tools have been stretching our capacity to communicate multimodally, offering both professional designers but also lay people increasingly versatile, curated arrays of semiotic resources, fonts, photo filters, and so on, to select from, combine, and manipulate with ever-increasing use, so that most of us can now edit a music video in iMovie, for example, add a background to a Facebook post, and so on, at with a few clicks, if you like. Semiotic software has also become indispensable in both professional and private social practices. Applications for media and text production, for example, Microsoft Word, and social media such as Twitter and YouTube are not only pervasive. In contrast to earlier semiotic technologies, such as the paintbrush, these applications offer diverse semiotic resources and simultaneously incorporate artificial intelligence about how we should use them, how we should co-deploy these resources, and how people should participate in different professional practices. For example, StoryPark here, in the middle, is a tool for pedagogical documentation and sharing information with families in early childhood education centers. There are also more everyday practices, such as sharing photos and videos and personal information on Facebook, or online shopping. So we argue that we need a critical multimodal approach to thinking about software. On the one hand, software raises many pertinent questions, and these questions need to be addressed in order to understand how ubiquitous software structures and makes possible much of the contemporary world, in the words of Matthew Fuller, who is one of the founders of the software studies field. Semiotic software technologies also, importantly, serve the interests of a very small number of powerful companies, Apple, Google, Facebook, and Microsoft, and the neoliberal values of the global corporate culture that they represent, as Van Dijk and colleagues have told us, looking at social media. The questions that we can address taking a critical multimodal approach include things like which semiotic resources do particular software products offer? Why and how do they privilege some resources while excluding or backgrounding others? How do software tools enable, constrain, and transform both semiotic and broader social practices? And what norms govern the design and use of software in particular social contexts? Systemic functional theory's qualities of being an applicable theory, committed to solving problems without allegiance to set approaches, as Halliday explains, and also its exotropic openness to dialogue with diverse disciplines and fields of practice, which Hassan has discussed in her work, have stimulated many advances in multimodal research and critical multimodal studies, which look at the role various semiotic resources and their co-deployment play in semiotic practices in creating and maintaining or exposing and subverting social divisions. Despite not focusing on software itself, studies like those that I have selected to reference here, and there are many more, highlight the value of systemic functional theory as a foundation for critical multimodal approaches to semiotic software. And in particular, I'd like to mention the work here of multimodal researchers using systemic functional theory to look at digital resources, their use and semiotic potential. For example, thumbnail images in online newspapers in John Knox's work, hashtags and selfies on social media in Zapavinia and Zhao's work. And so we know that we have a suitable foundation here with much work that has been done to build it. Now, admittedly, in composition, cultural media, and art and design studies, critical approaches to software have existed for decades. And we've presented some reviews in the references that I've cited at the bottom. They've also inspired the establishment of software studies, explorations of the interaction between computing, creative practices, and cultural trends that seek to explain, in Lev Manovich's words, how software is shaping our culture and how it is shaped by culture in its turn. Social media scholars have also examined social, economic, cultural, and technological constructs in social media, which are evident through algorithm-driven features such as like buttons, friends, connection suggestions, popularity rankings, and so on, and how these constructs exploit users' attention, data, labor, and social relationships. These studies, however, do not consider how software shapes people's capacity for multimodal communication and participation in social practices. So over time, starting with PowerPoint as one of our main case studies, we have developed a model for looking at software, studying software as semiotic technology. And I'll first introduce the model, and I'll note some reasons why I think systemic functional multimodal research has generally shied away from examining software as making it an object of study. Okay. So when we started our work on this back in 2009, and of course, Chris and Van Leeuwen, as you would expect, have done some thinking on semiotic technologies much before this work started. We started with the question of, can we study software like language as a semiotic resource? And so here, what that means, for example, for Halliday, is that studying language as a semiotic resource means that we are trying to explain the nature of language, its internal organization and patterning in terms of the functions it has evolved to serve. Van Leeuwen had also noted software as a kind of semiotic resource, where he defines semiotic resources as the actions, materials, and artifacts we use for communicative purposes. And also adds then that we need to examine those together with the ways in which these resources are organized. Like language, software provides resources for acting in and understanding the world that we live in. It offers us a range of choices organized paradigmatically into menus and submenus that we can select from when making meaning. And in this way, it functions as a tool for acting in and making sense of our world. Yet, it is important to acknowledge that software differs from language, visual design, and other dynamic open systems. It does not evolve through its use, but is built and periodically updated by software companies to serve their interests rather than those of its users. So what does that mean for instantiation? When you're looking at software is an interesting question. So in our model, the black brace from software design to software use signifies that software developers, rather than users, define the semiotic potential of software tools. The dashed grey arrow from software use to software design, on the other hand, suggests the possibility that the use of a software application may, at the discretion of its owners and developers, inform its redesign. So that may be one reason why people like us, coming from a background in looking at language and other dynamic open systems, have shied away from looking at software because maybe they saw it as not worthy of their attention, or perhaps something that was outside of our focus. Software, a software application, a software tool is also not a text. Despite presenting various choices that have gone into a design through a particular interface, that has a particular spatial temporal or syntagmatic organization, software is not a text. A software tool is not an exchange of meaning that is cohesive and coherent with reference to a specific external, situational, and cultural context, if we are to follow here Halliday and Hassan's definition of a text. For these reasons, we have defined software as a semiotic artifact, a resource that has material form and incorporates selections from different semiotic modes that are out there in the culture, layout, texture, color, and sound, and media, visual, oral, print, and electronic, alongside norms about the practices and ways in which these should be co-deployed. Our investigations for software as a semiotic technology are built on the basis of Van Leeuwen's agenda for social semiotics. And so, adapting that, we have proposed that critical multimodal approaches to semiotic software should examine three dimensions. Software design, which is the resources available within a software tool, its interface, its help menu. Software use, in specific institutional and socio-cultural or socio-historical contexts, alongside discourses about software and how it is used, and consider both of those in the broader semiotic landscape and socio-cultural context in which software design and use interact. In our initial focus on PowerPoint, and to a much lesser extent other products, we've also looked at some other products for authoring texts and media content, such as Word, Adobe Photoshop, and After Effects. We adopted a semiotic resource perspective. And this is partly because these are resources for creating media, for creating texts, if you like. This involved starting from particular resources available within a software tool, layout, animation, or from the tool's design as a semiotic artifact, and then considering how they support, privilege, and digitally recontextualize certain semiotic practices. For example, how bullet points and other typographic resources in PowerPoint foster the practice Stefan Loewen has described as new writing, where cohesion and coherence are established through visual design and multimodal interaction rather than written language alone. Okay, so as I said, the origins of this work, for me at least, were in that Australian Research Council Discovery project, where we looked at PowerPoint, working with Theo van Leeuwen, who was the leader of the project, and Kay O'Halloran, and myself. We looked at all versions of PowerPoint for Windows that were released when the project commenced in 2009. That included starting from PowerPoint 3.0, which was released in 1992. That tells you how old I am. And then moving on to PowerPoint 2007, which was the newest version at the time that we started. We also looked at 34 slideshow presentations, which included 24 university lectures from engineering and cultural studies and 10 business presentations, all of these video recorded in 2010. And the slideshow files that were used in these presentations. I conducted follow-up individual interviews with the presenters as well, which I felt quite uneasy about, given that I come from a systemic functional background, where at that stage these ethnographic approaches were not quite something that we had a lot of, well, I didn't have a lot of expertise in that. All right, but then we were invited later to contribute to Søren Vigil Poulsen and Gunhild Folle's project, Social Media as Semiotic Technology. And they invited us to think about whether our model can be applied or adapted to look at social media in this way. So we used then the research network, the academic social network site, ResearchGate, as our case study. And we noticed that there were significant differences between these two broad types of semiotic software, for example, exemplified by PowerPoint and ResearchGate. So media design software, or software for creating texts, has menus and submenus organized according to resources and components of semiotic practices. So layout in PowerPoint would be one such resource. Financial or logical or text formula in Excel would be another. The help menus offer advice on the use of particular semiotic resources, change slide layouts in PowerPoint. And so what these kinds of software tools do is they offer resources for designing semiotic artifacts and texts for a range of diverse communicative goals and contexts. For example, you can use PowerPoint to design a university lecture, just as you can use it to design a wedding slideshow, for example. ResearchGate and other social media platforms are organized differently. Their focus is not so much on offering a rich array of semiotic resources. Rather, these are embedded within templates for participating into particular social practices. So it is only when you're updating your Facebook post, for example, that you can then select emojis and backgrounds. Help menus then offer advice on the particular social practices that the platform is designed to support. For example, in ResearchGate, we read how to discover, add, edit, and remove research items, such as your preprint publications. How can I remove my ResearchGate score? And so what we have here are resources that are quite a lot more limited in terms of semiotic resources that are offered, and they're designed to support predefined communicative goals and context. In ResearchGate, the focus being on research communication and reputation building. In Facebook, broader focus on content and information sharing practices. So central to our model then is the distinction between semiotic and social practices, where semiotic practices are a type of social practice that can only be realized through the use of semiotic resources such as speech, layout, lighting, movement, and so on, taking a photograph, for example, or playing the piano. Social practices are, according to Van Leeuwen, the things people do to, for, or with each other insofar as they follow recognizable patterns. So social practices, we argued, encompass and extend beyond specific semiotic practices. So in Instagram, you do have basic photo editing options, but you can only apply those options to images once you've decided that you want to share these images. Okay, because the focus is on sharing content rather than on the image editing. So what that encouraged us to do then is, in addition to the semiotic resources perspective that we had been taking and thinking about, say, PowerPoint as a semiotic practice, to think about ResearchGate, and possibly that can be extended to other social media platforms, we believe, to think about this from a social practice perspective and think about how do these social media platforms digitally recontextualize certain social practices. So let me now have a look at a few examples, and I may have to skip through some, of how our explorations of semiotic software have been informed by systemic, functional, and social semiotic principles, concepts, and methods, but also how, by looking at semiotic software and trying to explain the power that it has, how we have extended some of these principles, concepts, and methods. Okay, so first of all, looking at semiotic resources. Let me just give you a couple of examples. One of the things that we started with was to explore texture. We were interested in how screen-based technologies recontextualize tactile resources. And so we conducted a comparative mapping of the properties and meaning potential of surface tactile texture, what you can sort of slide your finger over if you like, vis-a-vis visual texture. In this way, we were pursuing a new direction in research on multimodality, studying the manifestation of a semiotic resource in different media. We first examined, so starting from the broader context, not directly from PowerPoint, where you could argue texture options are not that prominent in the first place. We first examined objects made of various types of fabric, plastic, paper, leather, and metal. Then we looked at visual representations of similar materials and abstract patterns in paintings and photographs. And we reviewed studies of texture in sculpture, fashion, graphic design, art theory, cognitive psychology, and semiotics, because that's what an exotropic theory invites us to do. Echoing Crescent Van Leeuwen's work of on material resources such as color and voice quality, we modeled the semiotic potential of texture as deriving from provenance, the association of specific textures with particular socio-cultural and historical contexts, so the history and values associated with denim, for example, or cashmere, if you like, but also the physical bodily experience of the properties, physical properties of texture. What was interesting here is what we developed then for the physical properties of texture is a parametric system that sought to explain tactile surface texture in terms of 6 parameters: liquidity, viscosity, whether something is sticky or not, temperature, how hot or cold something feels, relief, whether it's flat or more relief, density, and rigidity. Now, viewing physical qualities as directly contributing to meaning, unlike the way, for example, graphetics or phonetics is modeled in SFL, as you know, in the model of language as a stratified system, is something that is somewhat different and reflects our multimodal approach. We also, as I said, use parametric systems that highlighted how each parameter is a matter of degrees, but also that each contributes to the overall meaning potential of a given texture, while also helping distinguish one from another. So we then also were able to look at visual texture and think about the ways in which it can or cannot recontextualize these tactile surface texture qualities. So for example, we noticed that variation in color, lines, shape, and perspective can depict different kinds of relief, density, as well as sort of more composite qualities such as roughness and smoothness or consistency. But there are also qualities that could only be depicted through the representation of specific objects. So depicting water to suggest liquidity, or depicting something sticky to suggest viscosity, and so on. And then again, we also have some visual texture qualities like abstract visual patterns that do not have a tactile equivalent. We also adopted a diachronic perspective and looked at texture in PowerPoint, across the different versions of PowerPoint. Okay? This helped us see the power of software to shape semiotic resources. Until 2007, for example, PowerPoint offered individual texture options such as green marble or paperback, whose meaning derives from provenance. PowerPoint 2007 then, though, enabled users to modify these parameters, such as transparency and regularity. So this then notes for us a shift from the logic of the lexicon towards the logic of grammar. And it also echoed Crescent van Leeuwen's argument that no semiotic resource is by nature either lexically or grammatically organized, and that it is possible, and I'm quoting here from Crescent van Leeuwen 2001, that a mode is grammatical to some of its users and lexical to others, especially where there is a gap between producers and consumers and the producer's knowledge is kept more or less secret. Okay. Now, the value of taking a diachronic perspective is, of course, well recognized in systemic functional linguistics and systemic functional multimodal discourse analysis, but I don't have time to discuss that right now. So another important shift in our thinking from a semiotic resources perspective is shifting from looking at semiotic resources to thinking about semiotic practices. And here we looked at normativity in both software design and use, and also Sumin Zhao, as I mentioned, developed some of our ideas into a really nice model of PowerPoint as a semiotic practice. So just some examples. So we recognized, drawing on theories of markedness in the Prague School of Linguistics, but also in the way these are discussed in Halliday's work, that we have two types of markedness that we need to recognize in the software's design. Okay? So on the one hand, some semiotic resources may be unmarked because they are formally simpler, like the blank slide layout option. They are formally simpler, and that also means that they are semantically broader than others. And this corresponds to Halliday's notion of what he calls formal markedness. But we also, so this is looking at what resources are available and comparing them with each other. That's why paradigmatic. But we also recognized something that we called symptomatic markedness. These are asymmetries in the different choices that are due to the way the software's interface is organized as a spatial-temporal kind of organization. So in this case, you notice, for example, that when you first open PowerPoint, you're invited automatically by default to start with the title slide. Then if you say insert slide after that, automatically you'll get the title and content slide. So yes, the blank option may be paradigmatically the least marked, but in terms of the spatial temporal organization of the software, other options are foregrounded. When you type in the body of a slide, automatically you have a bullet appear. Okay, so yes, you can go against that, you can delete the bullet, but that's an extra step that you need to take. So basically some options are easier than others. And so the software guides the way in which we use it. And this is where this is different from the notions of quantitative markedness in Halliday's work, and which is also related to instantiation. Okay. So just a couple of, just an example of that shaping influence. In our data set, all but 2 slideshows started with a title slide. So all of them had a title slide, or almost all. And 88% of the content slides had a title, and 60% of all slides that had text in the body presented that through bullet lists. Okay. We also looked at norms that are evident in the way software is used. And this is where we drew on the notion of foregrounding. Now, because our focus was not on highly valued individual texts, as in Mukarovsky's work or Halliday's work that uses this term, but rather on the use of ubiquitous software, we extended the concept of foregrounding, which Halliday defined as prominence that is motivated, so that a feature that is brought into prominence will be foregrounded only if it relates to the meaning of the text as a whole. We broadened that notion to include features that are motivated by the purpose or purposes of related texts or artifacts and the socio-cultural context that they represent. This allowed us to account for the influence of conventions beyond those that are built into the software application. For example, many presentations end with a thank you slide or a slide of references, for example. And this is not a template that PowerPoint provides. Regardless of how many people actually have such a slide, we don't have a template for that because the relationship here is not one of instantiation the way it is in language. And we were able to also observe, for example, that corporate presentations are strongly regulated by institutional norms and much more likely to employ the company's branding design, while cultural studies lectures, for example, that you can see some examples from on the right, display significant freedom in the composition and presentation of slideshows. We also considered discourses about semiotic technologies in the help menu and so on in interviews with the software users. And we thought about how these discourses legitimate whether and how people engage in relevant semiotic practices. This revealed conventions that software designers and users strive to follow, change, or subvert, which the analysis of a software tool alone and instances of its use cannot always reveal. It shows us that much of the explicit guidance provided through the paperclip in early versions of Microsoft Word, or the tips in early versions of PowerPoint, for example, you can create a graceful finish to your presentation by adding a blank black slide to the end, have become either templatized or default. So now I don't have to add that slide, it just comes up when I reach the end of my presentation. The interviews were particularly interesting because they revealed things that I believe we couldn't possibly see from just the slideshows themselves. A copyright expert, for example, whose slides were dense with technical writing, the ones that you can see on the left side here, said that actually he would love to be able to adopt Lawrence Lessig, who is a law professor at Harvard University and a co-founder of the Creative Commons, his style in presenting presentations. He told us that this style, which is meticulously designed, rehearsed and performed, and often has slides featuring just a single word or phrase or just a single against a black background, is one that he would like to adopt if he had more time to prepare his presentations. And it was interesting that later we were able to spot this style in a cultural studies lecture that you can see here on the right. And so thinking again here about semiotic practices rather than just resources, we developed, and Sumin Zhao developed this very elegant diagram to illustrate our thinking about PowerPoint as semiotic practice. Here we have 3 dimensions of PowerPoint as a semiotic practice: the software's design, the composition of the slideshows, and then their presentation. They are connected by 2 semiotic artifacts, the software itself, but also the slideshow. In the first dimension, software designers draw on their familiarity with various semiotic practices and design conventions when they decide which semiotic resources the software should offer and how these should be presented through its interface and help menu. They, in this way, construct the software as a semiotic artifact with built-in semiotic regime. Now, this regime enables, so this artifact enables and constrains the second dimension, what we do when we compose slideshows. And they also shape the authors of the slideshows, their understanding of the communicative purpose and context which the slideshow is designed to serve. The slideshow is the defining semiotic artifact in the dimension of the presentation itself. Presentations are complex multimodal events during which presenters, who may or may not have designed the slides, they reinterpret the words, images, and other resources in the slideshow and combine them with speech and actions in response to their understanding of the social context of the presentation and the norms that govern it. Here we see a corporate presentation in which the Deputy Vice Chancellor explains to how a new campus plan has been developed to new employees. She explains that and uses gestures to relate the slides to the audience in the room, but also to buildings outside through exophoric reference. For example, she says here, this big construction site in the middle of the building over here, that's the multi-purpose sports hall. So she's pointing both to the reference and also to what is outside. And I have to say that Sumin Zhao did a very detailed analysis of the gestures. Okay. We also know this sort of model has also helped us think about, again, the slideshow as a semiotic artifact, something that is not quite a text in the way that Khalid and Hassan define text. So here we have a slide from a cultural studies lecture, and it is not until you see the speech that you can really figure out what is happening here. Now, the speech reveals that the lecture belongs to the discussion genre in history, following Martin and Rose. The two bullet point lists present a set of questions raised by the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and three views on these questions. It is also the speech that reveals the main thesis of the lecture as a type of exposition, namely that the term and concept of an Eastern Europe versus a Western Europe has existed throughout history. The speech reveals that the organization is rhetorical rather than temporal because there are a lot of internal conjunctions used, going back to the opening point, for example. And most importantly, perhaps, from a critical perspective, if we follow Bernstein, we notice that the pedagogic relation and the relationship, the lecture's goal, spacing, and sequencing, in other words, what Christie has then redefined as the regulative register, for example, the use of direct address here, tells us that this is only revealed in the speech. There's reference to your mandatory readings. Okay? The slide then only construes what is the instructional register. Okay. So in some ways, the new writing that is used in these lecture slideshow could promote a disassociation of power from expertise and obscure some of these pedagogic relations if we just rely on the slideshow. And I'm severely running out of time, but just very briefly, I wanted to mention what we did in our work on ResearchGate. And this was moving to think about what was happening on social media platform in terms of social practices. So to examine how software digitally recontextualizes social practices, we used Van Leeuwen's model for analyzing the relationship between discourse and social practice. It allows us to examine social practices in terms of their component elements, actors, activities, times, locations, and so on, and how they have been transformed when a social practice is represented in discourse. So taking a social practice perspective, we examined ResearchGate's protocols for evaluating a member's contribution, for example, evaluating a paper that someone has shared, and how these recontextualized a comparable established practice, such as the double-blind peer review, whose shortcomings, for example, the long duration of peer review, is something that social media for researchers promise to overcome. Specifically, we compared these different components, and then we look at how they were, of the two practices, and actors, times, and so on, and eligibility conditions, and compared how ResearchGate transforms that kind of practice of what you might term peer review. So some of the transformations that our comparison revealed include the deletion of social actors with gatekeeper functions, such as the journal or volume editors, who select reviewers for each submitted manuscript, and these reviewers then have to have certain expertise. Academic publishers are also removed from ResearchGate. There is an addition of resources for speedy and positive evaluation of contributions. It is very easy to click recommend or like. The removal of anonymity, an increase in the number of potential reviewers, because anyone who is a ResearchGate member can write comments on anything you post in ResearchGate if they care to follow a number of links to actually write these comments. But by anyone, I mean that could be someone who is working as a barista at a university, anyone who has an academic institution or research institution email address, as well as anyone who has a single publication, which may or may not be in your area of expertise. So this approach to analyzing and comparing social practices without reducing them to discourse is consistent with our argument that social media platforms function primarily to enable social practices, which include but are broader than specific semiotic practices. Okay. So in the last 10 or so minutes that I've got left, I'd like to just briefly mention some of the recent work that we've been doing to think about how we can extend that critical approach to software to multiliteracies education. Now, a lot of work has gone into defining what we mean by multimodal literacy and what we mean by critical multimodal literacy. So Van Leeuwen, for example, argues that multimodal literacy is the ability to use and combine different semiotic modes in ways that are appropriate to the given context. And so it includes being able then to creatively respond to the unique demands of specific situations, which requires knowledge of what can be done with different semiotic modes and how, and an understanding, especially now, of the ways technological tools favor certain forms of discourse. Multimodal literacy is also a form of critical literacy. Becoming multimodally literate entails attending to the norms that govern communication in different contexts and to authorial decisions in multimodal texts, what has been chosen, but also what hasn't been and could have been chosen, recognizing the social values they reflect. And here we also have Mills and Lenard's work, who have very strongly, like others from a social semiotic perspective, argued for the need of a meta-language and an explicit approach to help literacy educators develop an in-depth knowledge of the semiotic relationships between different modes, the division of labor between them, and so on, but also then to teach that explicitly to young learners. It's one of the things that we have been arguing in our very recent research is that we need to learn from studies of young learners' digital literacy practices and the way in which they have focused on observing, documenting, and theorizing children's digital practices using both interactional or conversational, in some cases, analysis, social semiotics, but also methods such as ethnomethodology and digital ethnography. Because what these studies have shown is that young learners do have diverse and complex experiences with digital media and funds of knowledge about meaning making. But what these studies have done is mainly to make broader recommendations for pedagogies and the fact that they need to build on learners' funds of knowledge, and yet not really offered any models for how this should be done. And also there's a need in these studies for a critical multimodal perspective, as a review by Kuchurkova et al. Has shown. Now, research into explicit multiliteracy pedagogies has focused on defining multimodal literacy, what I mentioned previously, and in that either developing pedagogies and meta-language, often on the basis of text analysis and systemic functional theory, but in some studies also implementing such pedagogies in the classroom and evaluating their success. So often in this type of research, the focus is on using systemic functional theory to develop pedagogical frameworks that address particular curriculum outcomes. And the findings show that students, for example, Kathy Mills argues, when they interact with digital media, they must learn both the sign system in the digital interface, for example, in editing things like flip and move and delete and so on, but also that meta-language that we introduce. Other studies, such as Angela Thomas's work, for example, or Victor Lim Fei's work, have shown that overt pedagogies do improve multimodal literacy skills, And yet there are sometimes difficulties in whether the meta-language is actually taken up by children, for example, to explain their authorial decisions. And often teachers might also comment on the need for a simplified meta-language for some learners. So this is why what we think we should do is to adapt multimodality concepts and frameworks for the classroom, but do that by starting from insights into young learners' existing knowledge about multimodal meaning making and digital technologies. Now, in thinking how our model could inform and whether it could inform a critical approach to software in multiliteracies education, some of the challenges that we have considered is, for example, whether children actually have access to different kinds of semiotic software and are aware of their existence, whether they have experience with these technologies, but also perhaps one of the biggest challenges is that need to attend to the broader socio-cultural context and semiotic landscape, and whether children have that awareness of the broader socio-cultural context, including of non-digital technologies and semiotic practices, so that they can evaluate what Kress has called gains and losses, because looking at the gains and losses involved in new digital technologies means taking a historical perspective to notice these issues and changes in representation. And it involves looking at that larger social, cultural, political, and economic environment, that large semiotic context. So I'd like to illustrate some of the sort of initial ideas that we got through work that I have been involved in with Chow Tseng from Bremen University, and also Victor Fei Lim at National Institute of Education in Singapore, in which we've looked at transmedia narrative, in this case focusing on the fantastic flying books of Mr. Maurice Lesmore, which is a transmedia narrative in that it first appeared as an award-winning short film, then as an interactive picture book app, and then was also produced as a traditional format picture book. We've been looking at the potential of children's engagement and authoring of transmedia narratives to demonstrate some of the funds of knowledge that they have about different modes in media, because engagement with such transmedia narratives or narratives in different formats actually, even very young children, 4 to 5 year olds in shared reading interactions, for example, that are recorded, demonstrate that it encourages them to compare different modes in media. But in this case, what I'll be drawing on is just one child's, Lego animation, in which what he did, here we have 10-year-old Olen, what he did is reproduce one of the very important scenes in that narrative, in which Maurice, the main character, shares books with others, and when he shares the books with others, they are transformed. So, for example, in different ways, of course, according to the medium used. So, for example, in the film, when that boy takes a book from Maurice, you can see him changing from monochrome to color. In the app, users can drag these different books, and then the people in the queue change into characters from these different books. So, for example, here, that person, if you drag Alice in Wonderland, he changes into the Mad Hatter. So, and here in the book, that change is perhaps a lot more subtle because it is not dynamic, but you can see again the boy changing color. So what did Olen do? He recreated that scene from Maurice Lesmore, the Maurice sharing books, and in his case what was emphasized is the fact that books were transforming people. He used 2 software tools, Stop Motion Studio on the iPad and GarageBand on the iMac, an old version of GarageBand. And after that, we interviewed him about this design process. So I will be drawing on this interview and our analysis of the animation, the 2 software tools that he used to make some points about children's funds of knowledge and how we can use them. But I'll let you watch the animation first. I am aware that I'm severely running out of time.
The Fantastic Flying Books of Mr. Maurice Lesmore. Books transforming people. The end.
Okay, so Olen's transmedia authoring decisions were informed here by his familiarity with both different software tools and the affordances of non-digital media. He decided to use Lego because he could easily make a library setup with Maurice Lesmo and the other characters, and he could signify the building as a library using certain blocks, and also as a happy place by using yellow. And he also thought that using Lego allows him to easily transform the characters by just changing some of their attributes. So changing the face, well, is that an attribute? From a frowning to a smiley face, and changing a coffee mug with a cap and so on. Olen also mentioned other video and animation software such as Filmmaker and Adobe Premiere that he was familiar with, but he did emphasize that Stop Motion Studio was easy to use, which echoed the way the product is marketed as the world's easiest app to get you into stop motion movie making today. Okay, and especially a tool that you can use for those groovy Lego shorts on YouTube. He also demonstrated awareness of some semiotic resources that the two software applications offered and associated traditional as well as digital semiotic practices. He liked that Stop Motion Studio offered the possibility of recording a voiceover and importing, overlaying and syncing different soundtracks with each other and with the visual track. He also used Stop Motion Studio, which was like the free counterpart of Stop Motion Studio Pro, which offered no sound samples. And this led him to create the music track for the animation using the magic mode in GarageBand. He liked that because it allows him to pre-listen different styles and then change things in them. So from this perspective, then Magic GarageBand offered key advantages, for example, allowing him to play instruments that he can't play or doesn't have at home, but also to use a particular music style, start from that and then modify it. And in this way, this I think is a distinctly digital semiotic process. Okay. The design of the software also shaped the animation decisions that Olen made. Okay, so not having sound samples, design themes, or options for creating title and credit screens, visual filters, special effects, and so on in that free version of Stop Motion Studio, Olen designed the title page on paper, and then he relied on a transparent piece of Lego to attach what is the flying book. After they read it, it flies away, even though to some of you it might look like he's throwing it up in the air, to various points of the building, so that he could incorporate the flying book's motif that is so important in the original narrative. This was a creative solution to being unable to photo edit frames or use digital compositing in Stop Motion Studio. Other features were available in Stop Motion Studio but not emphasized. For example, the grid is not activated by default, nor is setting it up required as it might be in more professional design software. No prompts inform users that Stop Motion Studio, even that free version, offers an onion skill tool which can be used to overlay and align frames. Knowing about these resources, I think may have stimulated Olen to experiment with the position of the iPad camera and thus with focalization. His decision to shoot the film from a single static point and turn the characters towards the camera as actors in a theatre would do, so the audience can see their transformation, could simply also, though, reflect a lack of awareness of what is possible and that it is possible to use images taken from different angles to build an animation. So, what are we suggesting here? I think this case study suggests some ways in which we can use that model for approaching software from a critical perspective in multi-literacy pedagogies. So on the one hand, we could start from certain semiotic resources. Young learners may or may not be aware of the semiotic resources a tool offers and the practices it could support. Guiding them to examine these resources, the design of a software product, for example, what resources are available, how they are presented, and so on, could be an important step in equipping them to employ the tool effectively. We could also approach the software critically and consider which semiotic resources a given product could have included or made easier to use but does not. How does its design recontextualize and regulate particular semiotic and social practices, and whose values and interests it serves? And now, to prompt young learners to explore these questions, one thing that we could do is to examine software in relation to broader semiotic and cultural and sociocultural practices. So we could invite them to compare software products designed for similar semiotic or social practices, and but also possibly for different audience. So stop motion studio, for example, with something more professional like Adobe After Effects, or YouTube with YouTube Kids, and so on. We could also, however, engage them in what we did here, in authoring transmedia narratives in both traditional and digital media, starting from the desire to tell a story that conveys a particular social theme, in this case the love of books and their transformational power, that could stimulate children not only to become aware of the limitations of digital technologies, but also to creatively overcome them. So, to summarize, I hope that my presentation has shown how by exploring software as a semiotic technology, we have extended systemic functional theory by drawing on and extending concepts and tools such as semiotic system, system network, text, stratification, markedness, foregrounding, and instantiation, by including a diachronic perspective as well as ethnographic methodology to enhance our knowledge of semiotic and social practices and their broader sociocultural context. And here are some further directions that others have already taken, as well as future directions that we could take. And I've already flagged some of them, but important ones might include that I don't think have been really looked at from a social semiotic perspective yet, moving beyond or below the interface to understand the affordances and limitations of computing as a semiotic resource, and developing and implementing critical multimodal approaches to software in multiliteracy education. And at this point, I'd like to say thank you for your patience. I'm sorry that I've presented what is quite a long presentation. I'm not sure if there will be time for questions.
Oh, thanks, Emilia. What a wonderful, deep and rich exploration of all the work you've done in conjunction with others in this really important area of development in applying SFL or SFS to, you know, such a important modern day context, because we're all using these softwares, aren't we? And in an increasing rate, and our children, you know, in an increasing rate. So learning how to understand them, make sense of them, and the practices is really critical work. So I would like to thank you on behalf of everybody. And no, you didn't go over time. We started a few minutes late. You were perfectly timed. So all good in that area. So I'd like to invite people to ask questions at this point. You can either just turn your camera on and unmute yourself, or proceed however you think fit. All right, well, I might kick it off if nobody's got a question. Emilia, I'm wondering whether you might spend a second to reflect for us on where your worries are in this world, because I think you've shown really beautifully what is possible in terms of applying the theory to different contexts like PowerPoint or ResearchGate or whatever. But I know you're a mum, and I know you work, you know, in childhood education. And I was just wondering, I know it's a kind of side issue and you might say too big a question to answer now, but since no one's asked a question, what are your worries in this space?
One of the worries that I hope to have at least flagged, if not foregrounded, is that worry of the need to coming from systemic functional theory, which has had considerable influence on multiliteracy pedagogies, and especially on developing the kind of explicit pedagogies and meta-language that are needed in order to make sure that children who may not all be like Olen in this example, and who may not have that access to different semiotic resources or knowledge of different semiotic resources, that all of these children are sort of, you know, can be in a context where that explicit pedagogy and meta-language are introduced, but at the same time, the need to make sure that that meta-language, the tools that we proposed, are not just tools that we have built through our detailed analysis of semiotic resources, for example, something like, you know, semiotic artifacts such as PowerPoint or what have you, and not only through our detailed analysis of texts, but that they are developed and adapted at a point that reflects an understanding of children's own funds of knowledge. So one of the things that Chawit Tseng and Victor Felim and I have argued in one of our recent publications in Discourse, Context and Media is that if you, for example, have even very, very young children, 4 to 5 year olds, when they interact with the transmedia narrative in, you know, interactive picture book app format and traditional picture book, they notice some of these differences in media, and the way they often talk about them would be things like noticing what happens to whom and who does what. So that suggests to us that, okay, well, maybe transitivity is a good place to start. So rather than starting from what are curriculum outcomes, or rather than starting from the theory, keeping the theory in mind, but also bringing in our understanding of children's own funds of knowledge, because it is only then that the tools, the meta-language that we introduce are perhaps more likely to be taken up by children and actually used, and also by teachers, I think, as well. So that's one of my worries. How do we bring together, you know, these perspectives that help us look at children's funds of knowledge and respect what they bring to the classrooms, for example, both as experiences and also ability to articulate this knowledge, and then our rich theories and so on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Thank you.
That's one of my worries. How do we do that? Because it's not easy.
Yeah, yeah. And I think we have Louise next.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you, Emilia. That was so really very interesting, and particularly to see that broad perspective on all of the work that you've done in this area. It's really amazing. One of my, not perhaps worries, but irritations is the templates, just going back to semiotic technologies, the templates that are used for website design, particularly information-oriented websites like a university website at the moment, where we scroll through, and instead of having, you know, taxonomic lists of menu items, we just have this unfolding array of, you know, thumbnail pictures that you can click on with no organization whatsoever that's visible behind it. And it's impossible to find anything on these websites unless you enter it directly into the search engine. I just wonder if you could comment on that, please.
That's very interesting, because Frank Serafini invited me to talk to his doctoral students last week, and they wanted me to talk about the work that I have done with, you know, a lot of support from and also Claire Painter, who are my PhD supervisors, on analyzing websites. And initially I was like, oh, I haven't done that in a long, long time. Natalia would be a far better person here to talk about that. But I think as well, you know, things have shifted there, similarly to the way they have shifted in maybe software, the tips that are provided in software on how to use certain resources. In website design, there is a shift to striving to have web page design that reflects the way a website is organized, and having templates just to plug content in as it comes. And so perhaps this is becoming less and less explicit in the website design as well. Does that make sense? So, you know, things like website hierarchy, does it still matter? Is it still there? I do think it is still there, because they still have to classify that content in some ways, but perhaps it's not something that is as explicit. And so what's foregrounded instead is more the newness of things and the corporate logos and the corporate framing of it all and the new content that is there to keep you visiting the page again and again, but not so much the logic of the organization. And so that's where I wonder whether websites nowadays are quite as useful in terms of presenting, you know, certain educational knowledge. You know.
Yeah. No, I think it's lost. I think it's lost a lot of its utility, and in fact, anything that we need as members of staff has been moved to a SharePoint site. You can't actually get it on the website anymore. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Angela.
Hi, Emilia. Thank you so much for such an incredible presentation. It's really exciting to be immersed in all of the theory, as well as something that really struck me was that example at the end, the data that you shared, the clip. And as you know, I'm really interested in children's everyday literacy practices and what they can do out of school. And one of the things I noticed in that clip was how cleverly the child, whether that was mediated by an adult or a teacher or not, was able to kind of hack the system by introducing different software to accommodate the fact that there was no sound in that. And I think one of the things I've been interested in is how children do that, how they actually hack what's there to get what they want. They know what they want, and they just, you know, use bits and pieces of different software to achieve that. So I guess my question is, and this is a question I've been talking over with many people, is how to encourage teachers to allow children to the freedom to go beyond what is there, to play, to experiment, and to hack to get what they want. And I guess my second kind of flippant question is, in your PowerPoint data, did you find that any adults, any lecturers hacked the system or did something interesting or went beyond what was normally the traditional way of presenting a PowerPoint presentation?
Presenting or designing a slideshow, that's kind of interesting. Yes, let me start with the first question. First of all, I have to say that I have been revisiting your work a lot, thinking about these questions, partly because in this case I didn't provide any background, I don't think, but with this, in this situation, we simply asked, Chawit Seng and I asked our own children to choose a scene from the narrative to represent in any medium they like. And so Olen was really into Lego stop motion animations, and Chawit's child Oscar is really into comics. So they recreated the same scene that they themselves designed. They, at that stage, did not know each other, so this is separating two separate ends of the world, and they drew on their own knowledge of the different media and preference for the different media to create, recreate the same scene. Now, how teachers can encourage that? I do think that teachers can encourage that by avoiding, you know, just presenting children with set tools, and that focus, that would you call it like a functional digital literacy focus on knowing how to use a tool, as opposed to thinking about how you can construct different meanings with whatever tools you are familiar with. So I think just broadening the scope of our focus when it comes to digital literacy is quite important. And while there has been a lot of, and I'm sure you'll be aware of that, a lot of theorization of what is critical digital literacy, where that has been emphasized, they haven't necessarily, for me anyway, it doesn't seem they're offering any specific tips or guidance on what teachers could do. And I think in this case, I think the reason why he did that is because he was just free to choose whatever he wanted to do. He could choose a different medium if he liked. He didn't have to do a stop motion animation. The focus was on choose any scene from that narrative and recreate it in a medium of your choice. So he just chose what he knew about. Now, the second question was whether some lecturers went against the grain of the software's design. Yes, a few did, not so much in terms of layout, although you could see in the cultural studies lectures, for example, in the design, they, you had people creating their own templates. And say one of the lectures that I showed, one of the examples that I showed was from journalism lecture. And she explained how she actually specifically had to use like the typewriter font because for her that was associated with journalism and sort of like the kind of practices that she was maybe a bit nostalgic about. But I have to think a little bit harder to answer your question about whether they went against the grain of the software design when it came to actually presenting those slideshows. I haven't thought much about that.
Thanks, Emilia. Yes, I think in my work, I've just found that teachers are more about the functional and just don't allow the kind of freedom that you and your colleague did with your children. So if only we could kind of mesh the two.
Exactly. That's something that we've been thinking about a lot. And the other thing is that Victor Lim Fei recently gave a presentation for our School of Education. And he talked about some of their work in bringing sort of these everyday outside of school practices into the classroom. And there was a bit of a pushback from the children in his studies, from the students in his studies, because they didn't feel comfortable with, school kind of almost like taking over and trying to appropriate these practices. So that's another challenge that I haven't yet thought about.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you so much.
And can I just say something back to Shushi's question? The other thing that really worries me, Shushi, is when teachers try to adopt sort of a multimodal approach to literacy pedagogies, and it seems to be superficially done. So the things that worry me that you still see sometimes are, for example, asking children to do an interpretive dance that shows their understanding of heat transfer. How would you evaluate that? And how would children demonstrate what they wanted to achieve? And at what stage are you going to evaluate their understanding of the various science concepts behind it and so on? That's an extreme example. But even things like designing a container that can hold a block of ice frozen for as long as possible. Some children see that as a design task and they bring it into the classroom and they may not realize that actually, no, this is not about whether your block of ice has remained frozen or melted. This is about you being able to explain how you've used certain materials in order to prevent certain heat transfer or slow down certain heat transfer processes. So you still need to have a sort of like a procedural explanation and so on. It's not just the work involved in designing the product that is important. So yeah, that's another thing that worries me.
Thanks, Emilia. Can I add to that? I even feel like the same thing happens at university. I've spent the last couple of years analysing all the essay questions, essay prompts in the whole arts degree at UOW in first year. And it's the same thing. There are questions there that teachers pose to students that don't ask students to show what it is teachers want to see. So they ask something and then wonder why students haven't delivered what they thought they were asking. Well, it's because they weren't asking it. I think it's one area that we haven't focused very much on in SFS and SFL, which is how and what is asked. I mean, maybe it happens more in the school context, doesn't happen in the uni context. Everyone's just left to their own devices to write their own essay questions, right? And no one even sort of takes a social semiotic approach to looking at the language and meaning in that, and then wondering why you get that response and not what you wanted. I mean, I think that's absolutely a lack of awareness case. Yeah, thanks, Emilia.
Emilia, I can validate your example. In grade 4, I won a block of chocolate for my ice block not melting for ages, but there was no talk about heat transfer at all. I was just quite happy with the chocolate.
I was very, like one of my children was very worried about, is my block of ice actually going to, still be frozen if I'm presenting it, 2 o'clock in the afternoon rather than early in the morning. I was like, well, that's not actually the point. What are the 3 heat transfer processes and what are they called? And, what are the causal relations and so on? Yeah. I think I've probably outstayed my welcome.
No, not at all. I think we've got till 10:30. So does anyone have any other questions or comments for Emilia? Okay, well, oh, sorry, go on.
So I was just so interested in your earlier description of the disconnect between design and user, or the possible disconnect. And this is just more of a comment that I'm personally exploring with website design, a methodology called user experience. It's big in library spaces. I'm not sure if you're interested or aware of that one, but it's pretty fun because you get users doing tasks, and you get a wonderful transcript, and you get all sorts of extremely honest comments. And to speak to Louise's comments about web pages, you know, they'll get a comment like, so what do you see in front of you? And then the user will say, a wall of text, right? And you get these sort of, you then can design from the experience and go through cycles of tweaking. Yeah.
I am aware of these perspectives, but possibly not of the most recent developments of these fields, because for my PhD, I looked at the research, but also professional literature into web usability, user experience, graphic and web page interface design, if you like, and so on. The difficulty there was to move from their sometimes isolated from each other perspectives. So we're looking at website hierarchy as, you know, like how quickly you can get to something, how many clicks from the homepage something is, versus how the content is actually meaningfully grouped together. Moving from those, reconciling them, and also then thinking about which of our tools may be useful to adapt to looking at websites. So yeah, I don't know where these things have gone further, but again, like, you know, if someone tells you there's a wall of text, then again, what have we got to offer, and how can we present it in a way that makes sense to people who don't have that background in SFL, for example, is one of the challenges for me.
Okay, I'm going to cut it short here because I got it wrong and you were right, Emilia. It was meant to be 1 hour. I thought it was 1 hour with half an hour questions, but I don't think anyone's minded having this break.
I really, really appreciate that, but people probably need to have a slight tea break.
Yeah, well, they have 6 minutes to rush and get a coffee or a tea, and then we'll be beginning the parallel sessions. Everybody, you should check your email from Vin about the 2 changes today in the parallel sessions. But yes, just a round of applause, please, for Emilia for a really wonderful, rich and up to the minute, you know, presentation of your and your colleagues' work in this space. Thanks so much, Emilia.
Thank you so much, Susie and Emilia and everyone. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And Thomas is not here. Thomas, really, I need to make him a co-slot. Where is Thomas? Can you see him now? Angela is here. Susie. So we are going to do three breakout room. Please feel free to grab a cup of tea or water for 5 minutes, and then we will back at 10:30. So now I'm going to do the breakout room. So we know I already enter in the chat spot. One session in Thomas, one presentation in Thomas session will be rescheduled. Here will be rescheduled in my session, the final. So I need to do. Hello, Thomas, are you there?
Yes, sorry, just got to the office.
No problem. Thomas, you may not have a chance to have a look at my email yet, so please let me.
I actually did just see
that's
it.
wonderful. So you already know, right, the change? Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you, Thomas. That's wonderful. So I'm going to do the breakout room now, everyone.
I'll be in breakout room 3, will I, Vin? Because I'm in the 3rd strand.
You are in breakout room 3, Susie. Thomas in breakout room 2, me in breakout room 1.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And see you all again soon. Bye. See you soon. Do I get to mark group presentation now?
Mark Cook. Lucy, great to see you here. Lucy, please click on room 3. And you will see when you click on room 3, you will see the word John, and you click on John. Room 2, sorry, room 2. Okay, that's okay. Thank you, Lucy. So I'm going to John Brecker room 1 now. So see you again in during lunchtime when we are back to the main room. Thanks everyone, and see you again.